good. That's fine. All right, we're going live, and we are live. All right, everybody. Welcome back to the House Government Operations and Military Affairs Committee. We're here this afternoon to hear a walkthrough of the Senate proposal of amendment to H-270. Thanks for doing this, Michelle.
So good afternoon, Michelle Childs, Office of Legislative Counsel. And because this has not yet passed the Senate, you'll be taking a look at the Senate Economic Development Committee strike-all amendment that you should have, as well as an individual instance of amendment from Senate Finance. And then Senate Appropriations voted it out without amendment. So I'm going to first just walk you through the Senate Economic Development Amendment, and I'm just going to focus on the changes. So going to the first change is on page 2. Oh, sorry. Page 3, sorry. So there is a new section 3 that was added. This was requested by the Cannabis Control Board. This is just a technical amendment. So this is amending the language for the Cannabis Regulation Fund. So remember, that's the fund where all of your licensing fees, application fees and such go into. And for FY24 and 25, you're having the excise tax money go there too, because the fees are not covering everything in terms of the rollout. And this is just a technical amendment. You'll see on line 16 and 17. Is that it just refers to currently that it's the monies from the fees from the cannabis establishments, the adult use market that goes in there, but it's actually supposed to be for the medical registry and the dispensaries as well. And so I think that that was just an oversight at some point. So that's just a technical. The next change is on page 5, section 5. And so this is amending the section with regard to regulation by local government. And there's just some clarifying language that has been added. And if you look at page 6, there's 2 things that this is doing. In subsection C, you'll see that it says that prior to issuing a license to a cannabis establishment, the board has to ensure that the applicant has obtained a local control license from the municipality if that's required. And the new language adds, unless the board finds that the municipality has exceeded its authority under this section. So municipalities have very limited authorities with regard to regulation of the of a licensed cannabis establishments that is regulated by the board. And that's already set forth in statute, and that this is not changing it with respect to that. However, you'll see there's some language that has been added to clarify in subsection D, where it says in current law, municipalities shall not prohibit the operation of a cannabis establishment within the municipality through an ordinance or a bylaw. And that was adopted in 2020 when you set up the adult use system. And the idea was that when you enumerated the things that a municipality could do, you wanted to clearly set forth in statute that it was not within their purview to essentially prohibit these establishments if they met the requirements under state law and could be licensed under state law. And what the board has seen, and they can speak to this a little more, is that while some towns may not be putting it directly in their local laws to say these types of businesses are prohibited, they are creating requirements within their bylaws or ordinances that effectively prohibit them. So if you're creating such a high bar that they can't meet that, then it's kind of it's having the effect of banning them without specifically saying that they're prohibited within the municipality. And I think the board can talk to you if you want to talk to you a little bit more about that. So subdivision D1 in that added language is just a clarification of the existing language, because that D1 originally, the intent was that not just that you can't say specifically in your ordinance cannabis establishment is prohibited, it's that you can't, through the use of your ordinances and bylaws, effectually prohibit them through creating such restrictive bylaws and ordinances that they can't comply.
Representative Nugent.
Who's the ultimate authority in deciding whether or not that is the case or that's been done?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the second half.
Who's the ultimate authority in deciding whether or not that has happened in this case?
Well, there's two layers. So if the local municipality decides to regulate within what they're allowed to do under current law, then the licensee would have to get whatever local license or permits at the local level. And then right now, the way that it is that the board, CCB, would have to ensure that they've obtained any required local permits before they issue the state permit. And what this is doing is saying that that the board up in subsection C is that if the board determines that the municipality has exceeded its authority under the statute and has gone beyond what they are permitted to do under statute, then the board can go ahead and issue the state license.
So that really takes some zoning authority away from town that they currently have or possibly could.
I mean, I think section is not changing their authority. So it's not changing what they can do. It's just saying that, and, I don't want to, it might be best if you want to talk perhaps to the board about what they're seeing and the concern about whether or not some municipalities are complying with the spirit of the law currently.
Other questions about this? I think these questions about municipal control are tricky because we're saying that, like a liquor control board, municipalities can have cannabis control, but what we're really saying here doesn't really have to do with that. It's about the use of their ordinances and bylaws to just make it impossible for.
Exactly. So if you created such a high bar that so if you said you have to have a 200-foot setback, you can't have any odor at all at the property line. If you say you can't, if they create such a burden on there that it's essentially impossible to run a cannabis business and comply with those provisions, and and you're effectively prohibiting them through having such onerous provisions, then that's not allowed under D, under existing law with that clarification. And then in subsection C, if the board finds that the municipality has exceeded its authority in what it can do, like if it's perhaps adopted something that says, there's putting certain requirements that they don't have authority under this provision or state law to do, then the fact that they didn't get a local license is not going to prevent them from getting a state license if the board feels as though they've exceeded their authority under statute.
That's very clear to me. Questions about that from the committee? Thanks, Michelle.
So next section is section 6, and this was added to the Senate Economic Development Amendment at the recommendation of Senate Agriculture. So last year, the General Assembly provided certain benefits to small cultivators, so cultivators of 1,000 square feet or less, and they get certain benefits of farming without getting the whole panoply of benefits. And what section 6 does is it expands that to apply to all outdoor cultivators. And so if you look at page 8, You'll see the language on subsection F. Right now, it's limited to small cultivators, but that is striking the word small, but it still is only applying to outdoor cultivators, not to indoor cultivators. And so you'll see the benefits on page 9 around ability to enroll in current use. Something that's changed there is that under current law, the land already has to be enrolled in current use. That wouldn't apply if this language passed. They wouldn't be regulated by municipal bylaw in the same manner that RAPs are not regulated by municipal bylaw. They'd be regulated in the same manner as farming. So they'd be exempt from Act 250. And then also they get certain sales tax benefits. And then you'll see in subdivision 5, they're entitled to a rebuttable presumption that cultivation doesn't create a nuisance under the right to farm law. There is a fiscal note on this. I don't know if Andrea has a link to that, but you can probably find that either on Senate Appropriations or Senate Finance website, and link to that for folks. So the testimony was that by increasing it from small cultivators to include all outdoor cultivators, excuse me, that it would be an increase of about 8 additional acres statewide. So it's relatively small.
8.
Yes, sorry. And I have allergies. I'm not coughing COVID on y'all. I'm sorry. So that's that provision. And so that was the recommendation of Senate Agriculture, and it says Senate Economic Development accepted that amendment.
I will tell the committee while we're on this section, I spoke to Chair Kornheiser, Chair Durkee, and Chair Sheldon, who all signaled that they were comfortable with this number of acreage of outdoor grow, and that Representative Sheldon brought up in a conversation that it might actually encourage people to to grow outdoor instead of having, energy intensive indoor. I don't know if that's really the case, but it's at least one benefit, because it just gets treated as agriculture in the way that most other crops that people grow treated.
Okay, so next changes are on page 13, and this is in the accessibility of records for the CCB. And there were just a couple technical amendments that Senate Economic Development made in consultation with, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember their name, but the public records person at the I don't remember the new name of I'm sure y'all do hear from her. Tanya.
Sorry.
Tanya Marshall. Yeah, I was going to say straight archivist, but isn't it a different name now for the office or something? But so they worked with her because she wanted to just tweak the language. So you'll see that there's new language in subsection D. That is just the way in terms that we phrase that that the record is confidential or not. And so it's just been changed to shall be available for public inspection and copying under the Public Records Act. But there's no policy changes in here from what you passed out.
Sorry.
Page 15, section 12. This is just a new section identifying the time period for the implementation of the new propagation license. So you remember that you added a new propagation, kind of a nursery license category. And this is just saying that, excuse me, the board has to issue those on or before July 1st of next year. Okay, next changes are going to be in your medical section. So there are some changes that were made to section 954 with regard to caregivers. It's running on page 20 and I didn't highlight anything on there, but what you had on caregivers, remember you're changing from a fingerprint supported CIC check to a Vermont conviction record. Thank you. And a check of both of the protection registries, the child abuse and the adult protection registry. And you directed both of those agencies to adopt rules for how they would release those records to the CCB, but there's already statutes in Title 33 already for who they can release those records to. So instead, we've taken out the provision around rules and directed them to release those records. And so that's in section 954. You have a new subsection E. That's just a statement of the way that it is currently, which is that Medicaid funds are not to be used to support caregivers. I'm gonna have to get a glass of water.
We can take a break.
Yeah, actually, Michelle, go ahead and please. I got actually.
I have a couple of questions I would ask Chair Pepper if he's willing to jump in while we lost Michelle.
Yeah. We didn't used to do this. Right?
I was about to stand up and go.
Jump right in.
Community effort.
I was like, she's not very good. She's not getting better. Yeah.
Hi, for the record, James Pepper, Chair of the Cannabis Control Board. I'm happy to answer a question or pick up where Michelle left off. The amended language in this medical section was a request of DCF and Dale. They're authorized to share records with certain people by statute, and they just wanted us to be added to that list of people that they can share records with. The original language said that they had to come up with rules in order to share, and they didn't want to have to go through an extensive rulemaking process. So you just added a statutory provision that allows them to share these abuse and neglect registry results and the child sexual exploitation results as well with the Cannabis Board.
It's good to have you back, Chair Pepper. Been a few weeks since we were on this while the Senate was working on this bill. I was going to ask specifically to going back to I think the biggest change here policy-wise is the ag language. And so I just was going to ask kind of the board's position on that.
So, we supported the ag amendment. We were neutral on whether Act 250 should apply to outdoor cultivation. We really think that that's a policy choice for, the legislature to decide. It will certainly allow existing farmers to use their existing farm equipment and their existing farm structures to cultivate cannabis and kind of narrow. So I think it is in line with the intent of the bill, which is to support small local farmers. And so, we don't know, we're not 250 experts, so we don't know the full scope of what that could do, but it was determined by both agriculture committees, I think, that outdoor cultivation should be exempt from 250. With respect to the question around, does the changes here, the ability for the board to issue a license, even if we don't have all local permits, really it's a very narrow set of circumstances where we would be allowed to do that. And it's really if we find that a ordinance that was passed locally had the effect of prohibiting cannabis cultivation within their municipal borders. And you wrote in the original legislation that municipalities cannot do this, but we're seeing that they're finding clever ways of making generally applicable ordinances that have the effect of prohibiting cannabis cultivation within their borders. And the odor was a good one. You could say no odor at the border of, at any property line. That sounds like a generally applicable, that it would apply to all agricultural odors. But in fact, because of the right to farm exemptions, it only applies to cannabis. So, and then even even further than that, it only applies to high THC cannabis because it doesn't apply to hemp, which is the same plant. So really, I think that amendment is in line with the intent of what you guys passed, in 2020, Act 164.
Any questions for Pepper about those pieces? Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. I just have one question about what you just said. So the difference in THC in a plant would not affect the smell in any way?
I would say no. I mean, maybe it's slightly more pungent if it's above that 0.3%, but really a hemp plant and a high THC, a low THC hemp plant is flowering when it reaches that 0.3%. So the odor is present at that point. And then, maybe it's present at a higher level potentially, if you're growing it to 15% THC. But, we're talking about maybe like a very short window, when it's growing, maturing from 0.3% to 15%. It's complicated, but
It is.
It is.
But just a normal person driving by couldn't tell the difference?
No.
Okay, thank you.
The medical section made, the Senate made a couple of substantive amendments to the medical. We asked for people that are on the medical registry with incurable or lifelong conditions like MS or Parkinson's need only reapply for their medical card once every 5 years as opposed to annually. And again, doctors, healthcare professionals that are signing the form are just attesting that this is a patient in their care and they have this condition, not recommending cannabis, not prescribing cannabis. They're just verifying that condition exists in the patient that's in their care. The Senate felt that should be reduced to once every 3 years as opposed to once every 5 years. So the annual, it won't be an annual, it'll be a once every 3 year renewal as opposed to what this committee passed, which is once every 5 years. And then they asked for a report back on the medical program. I think there was they heard a lot of the same testimony you did around, are these the right qualifying conditions? Are they not? Is there any information about dosing, proper dosing, or kind of people's tolerances to cannabis, specialty products that certain types of conditions may benefit from? They wrapped all that into a report and asked us to come back with recommendations about the future of the medical program.
All right, so it sounds like the spirit of what we had put in there is kind of remaining, but the knockdown 5 years, 3 on the registration for those particular patients with chronic and lifelong conditions.
Right.
All right. I wanted to ask the line where I think this is where Michelle was just getting to around the funds will not be used to support. That's the way it is now, right? Are we just kind of like putting a finer point on it?
Yes.
Okay.
Dale requested it.
I just wanted it to be very clear.
Yes.
All right. But no, that's not a substantive change in policy at all.
No.
Any other questions about that piece? That one popped out at me. What is that?
So I think James took you down through the report that Senate Health and Welfare recommended to Senate Economic Development, and then it takes you down to sections 22 and 23. And these work hand in hand with the Senate Finance Amendments, which adds sections 23A and 23. And this goes to trying to solve, hopefully once and for all, the decoupling of cannabis and tobacco in statute. So I think we talked about it a little bit earlier in the year. In the BAA, there was language that was clarifying that for tax purposes, the vape cartridges that contain cannabis oil are not to be considered a tobacco substitute and taxed at the tobacco rate. So when the adult use market was set up in 2020, there was very clear intent that cannabis taxes were over here. There's 14% excise tax with a 6% sales tax, and that's to be applied to cannabis and cannabis products. And then there was no discussion of applying the tobacco taxes to cannabis as well. But because of some of the definitions that are embedded in the tobacco laws, there was, people could read into that somehow cannabis might have been looped in there. And so what you have in section 22 is an amendment to the definition of tobacco substitute to clarify that tobacco substitute does not include cannabis products. You have something similar in section 23, which is that other tobacco products as well does not include cannabis products. And then for your Senate Finance Amendment, along the same line, section 23A is amending the definition of cannabis product to clarify that cannabis products don't mean tobacco products or tobacco substitutes or tobacco paraphernalia. It also clarifies that cannabis product does include any device designed to deliver cannabis to the body through inhalation of vapor that's sold at a cannabis establishment. And that is to address the devices that aren't like vapes where you're using a cannabis oil in a cartridge, but to use something like a PAX, which is to burn flour instead. And so these are just, I think, technical clarifications in accordance with what the original intent of the General Assembly was. And I think they're just, at the time, honestly, nobody was talking about tobacco, so I think it didn't even occur to us that you could read into the tobacco laws to think that they would apply to cannabis.
I would just add that, if a cannabis retail establishment wants to sell tobacco, in addition to selling tobacco paraphernalia, they have to get the tobacco license. This applies to a subset of people that want to sell, that are a licensed cannabis establishment that are under our jurisdiction, that want to sell cannabis delivery devices, cannabis paraphernalia, and no tobacco. So we want to create an incentive, which the current law requires, for these folks that are selling pipes, because again, we have 13 million tourists that visit Vermont every year. Some number of them are going to cannabis establishments. They don't have any way to kind of consume cannabis. If they're selling a pipe, under current law, they need to get a tobacco license, and they can also sell cigarettes and tobacco products. We want to eliminate that incentive for them to also sell cigarettes. And this language, this policy was in the bill that you passed, but it just took a little bit of clarification with the tax department and the Department of Health and liquor and lottery and the administration to make sure we weren't messing around with anything that might jeopardize federal funding.
And so the 23B section that's added in the Senate Finance Amendment is essentially replacing section 14 of what you passed, which was the language just trying to say that, you don't have, if you are a licensed cannabis establishment and you're not selling tobacco products, you don't need to get a DLL license. And through, as James mentioned, there were a lot of conversations between Ledge Council, CCB, Department of Tax, Health Department, DLL about trying to get this language right, make sure everybody was on the same page, and it was really clear. So if you look at the Senate Finance Amendment, you look at section 23B, it just says very specifically in there with the new addition of age that it doesn't apply to a cannabis establishment that is licensed to engage in retail sale of cannabis products, but not engage in the sale of tobacco products or tobacco sales. So if there was a cannabis establishment that chose to also sell e-cigs or things like that, they would need to get a DLL license. But if they're just selling cannabis and cannabis products, they do not need a DLL.
So we've removed the incentive for a retailer that is really just trying to sell cannabis products and cannabis paraphernalia. If there's any overlap between the use of that paraphernalia for cannabis and tobacco, they don't have to get a tobacco license if they're only selling cannabis and that particular product. Okay. That is what our intention was, as I recall. So it sounds like we did all of those stakeholders Chair Pepper kind of buy into that Senate Finance Amendment, or is there?
Yes, I mean, I've got emails from all of them. They just signing off, Charles Martin from DLL and Skylar from DLL, and Dave Englander and, Monica Hutt. All of them have signed off on the language, and Will Baker, the general counsel from the tax department. So they're all on the record with me.
All right, great.
We've been talking about this with them because of the implication of the tax since September or earlier of last year. So we've been trying to narrow this language in. It just takes time to coordinate with that many different agencies.
Are there any sections that we didn't hit at all?
One more.
Oh, because we went off into the Finance Amendment. All right.
And that's section 24 of the Economic Development Amendment. And so that is transferring $500,000 from the Cannabis Regulation Fund, which is your fund that is made up of fees. But for FY 24, 25, it's also going to be made up of the excise tax. And so it's moving $500,000 from the regulation fund to the Cannabis Business Development Fund, which is to be used for social equity applicants, and then transferring $500,000 out of the Cannabis Business Development Fund to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to fund technical provide loans. So you recall that when the legislation was created, there was an original $500,000 appropriation. There was also a fee there for integrated licenses to take into that fund. It's a revolving loan fund, but the fund is dedicated, and they're having, and so this is one-time money. Because the excise tax will be going to this fund, it should be, for those 2 years, it should be much.
Okay. And so the funding source for both of these $500,000 appropriations is the excise tax?
Well, it's combined. So generally that Cannabis Regulation Fund is just made up of application fees, licensing fees. But because the fees have not been able to carry out all the work of the board as you're building up the agency and adding compliance officers and all of these other things, is that the General Assembly has already designated that the excise, 14% excise taxes that would normally go to the general fund for FY 24 and 25 are going to be going into the Cannabis Regulation Fund. So for 2 years, the tax money plus all the fees will be in that fund. And so it's all stored up together. So, but it's just, it's not taking it, the board is short if it's just with the fees normally. And so you're adding extra money going there. And so you could say it's really just coming from the general fund because you're diverting that excise tax for 2 years from the general fund to the Cannabis Regulation Fund anyway.
Yeah, I think that the conversations I've had with Chair Wood and others, so the committee is aware, is the anticipation of being able to use more revenues from the sale of cannabis for the prevention purposes and other things that many folks in this building are interested in. But I think the board needs to be able to stand up the new market in order to realize that revenue hope. So if this facilitates that, it sounds like that's
right. Well, the money going, the excise tax going into that fund that's already, that's just, yeah.
Looks like questions about that. And, our colleagues, other committees are going to be looking at the dollars flowing. So I'm less concerned about that than here. But. Great. Well, any other questions for Chair Pepper or Michelle about the words on the page? I think this is on notice today. So I don't know if it has a rule suspension or when it's coming to us exactly, but I wanted to make sure because there were so many changes that we had a little time. No.
What's gone?
It's on notice in the Senate. Yeah, so they haven't actually, it's been through so many committees now that they haven't moved it along. So I anticipate getting it before we adjourn, but clock's ticking.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for walking us through this. I appreciate it. Do you anticipate any other amendments?
Well, Bryn actually just noticed something, the propagation license, and this is actually, it is somewhat substantive, so you may want to hear about it. In Act 164, you created 6 license types. Cultivation, product manufacturing, retail, wholesale, and a integrated license, right? And you said, there shall be 6 license types, and then we created a propagation license. So now there's actually going to be 7 license types. And the reason why this is relevant is because you also said no one can have more than one of each type. So you can't one company can't buy 6 cultivation, 30,000 foot cultivation licenses and essentially have, however much that is, that much cultivation. So if the idea behind a propagation was to allow a cultivator to have clean, tested source material, to be able to kind of purchase clones from a propagator and know that those clones that they purchased have been subject to all of the CCB regulations around testing and microbials and mycotoxins and everything else. So then the question then becomes, do you want cultivators to be allowed to get a propagation license as well? If it's a type of cultivation license, then they wouldn't be allowed to get both because they're only allowed one of each type of license. So if you create a 7th license type, identify it as a 7th license type, then a cultivator would be allowed to get a propagation license in addition to the propagation. It's very nuanced because of the way our system is set up. This 1 license per entity rule is the first of its kind. No other states do this. So you have to kind of have that as your framework when you think about, can a cultivator, it's a licensed cultivator, also apply for and get a propagation license? And this definition of there shall be 6 license types means that if we don't change that to 7, that means that a propagator will have to be considered a cultivator, and then you'll have propagators that are not allowed to also cultivate.
So will there be an opportunity to have that included?
Right.
Yeah, so that's
It sounds like a floor amendment for the Senate.
I think, but wouldn't it just be a technical amendment, which is just saying that there's a 7th type of license? Or are you guys saying that maybe it should be, or you're not recommending?
Well, Bryn just raised it with me when we were sitting here, so I don't.
I would see it as like we just should have added saying that there's 7 licenses instead of 6. We should add it.
901D, there's 3 plans to 901D. Cross-reference. Add to the list of 6 and then change it.
Right. I mean, I think unless you have some clear policy reason why you wouldn't want someone who's a cultivator to also have a nursery license, then I think this is just a technical saying that because we added a 7th license, and there's a few little cross references. And Brent and I had talked earlier in the year about making sure that we got all the cross references.
Yeah, just because there's no policy reason not to allow that.
I would say no, but this is a very prescriptive area of the law. So,
Representative Henry.
Would that mean that somebody could have more plants, not more square footage, but more plants?
it would be more square footage, but they're not allowed to. So that your cultivation license and the largest tier that's open right now, I think is 10,000 square feet. You could get a 3,500 square foot cultivation license or propagation license, but those plants have to be sold or moved to the market once they start to flower. So you can't just say, I now have 13,500 square feet of canopy. You know, a portion of that canopy has to be for immature, you know, juvenile plants that that then you could sell to other cultivators or to retail.
And the propagation license itself, those are all, yeah, none of those are mature plants.
So it is more plants, because you could make more revenue off it by selling those 3,500 acres or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. And I think, you know, I'm sure I'll get angry emails about this, but you know, the cost of a clone, depending on how big it is and how long you've cultivated it, it could be anywhere from like $8 to $30 for a clone. And then like the pound of, you know, harvested cannabis is significantly more than that. This is really trying to allow people that are really good at making clones provide clones for the entire industry, so that people can, you know, just like you would buy a tomato start instead of growing from seed, you know, you just purchase a plant that's already in the works.
Thank you.
So shouldn't we then limit cultivators from not being able to be propagators also?
I think that,
I know it's a policy
yeah,
decision, but that's where my mind is going. Yes.
well, that would probably defeat the entire purpose of having a propagator license in practice, wouldn't it?
You know, it might not be a viable business type. Originally, when we suggested a nursery license, we said that the canopy should be unlimited because of the relative price of a start seedling clone versus finished flower. And so really, you know, 3,500 square feet, you know, you might be able to be a viable business type with just that, but really, I think this is kind of an add-on to cultivation. But again, I leave it to the committee that created this market, really, like, you know, gave us the direction, to give us direction on this.
Well, we have some things that are coming up that we'll have to switch gears to, and we have some more time on this. I wasn't expecting the committee to take a position, but I thought while we had some time in our schedule before things get too hairy at the end here, I wanted to at least see what the Senate was proposing to us and start sparking the conversation. So I think we've done that admirably.
I would just say one last thing, if you don't mind. You know, our largest license site, you know, the 10,000 square feet, because we voted to close our 15,000 square foot license, is a tier 2 out of 11 in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, the largest license type is 100,000 square feet. So, you know, it's always, I think, important to keep the scale of what we're doing in Vermont. And I would also mention that 77% of our cultivators are 1,000 square feet or less. So the vast majority of our market is being driven by people growing, you know, plots the size of these tables, you know. That's a very important piece of what we're doing differently in Vermont compared to any other state.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Chair Pepper. We will probably come back to this once we see more progress on this bill in the Senate. So thanks for giving us a preview of coming attractions. I want to switch gears here and take up H291, which is coming right up for us. Just make sure I'm totally correct about where we are in process. But Becky, if you want to take the chair to walk us through the Senate's changes to our Cybersecurity Council bill. So this is on the notice calendar today. So this will be up for action tomorrow, unless we got rules to take it up for some reason.
Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. I did send a side-by-side comparison of the two bills. that might be posted on your webpage. So that might be the easiest thing to look at. Do you want me to wait for you all to find it, or should I start that?
What do you got? I'm good.
Okay, great. So the Senate proposal of amendment made a few changes, as you can see in the side-by-side from the House passed version. So I'll just start with section 1, which is adding the new chapter on cybersecurity in Title 20. So I've separated out the side-by-side into sections of the new sections that were added in that chapter. So starting with section 1 in the new section 4661, the definitions, the change from the House passed version of this bill is that there's a definition added in the Senate for essential supply chains. And as you may recall from this bill, that one of the that this definition is used throughout because the council is looking at the impact of cybersecurity on essential supply chain businesses. So the Senate added a definition to refer back to for that. And the definition that was added here is supply chains for the production in sufficient quantities of the following articles. So there's medical supplies, medicines, and personal protective equipment, articles essential to the operation, manufacture, supply, service, or maintenance of critical infrastructure, articles critical to infrastructure construction after natural or man-made disaster, articles that are critical to the state's food systems, including food supplies for individuals and household and livestock feed, as well as articles that are critical to the state's thermal system and fuels. And then there is another section that was added in the bill later on that relates back to possibly amending this definition, and I'll get to that in a moment. So then in section 1 still, in the new section 4662, which is creating the advisory council, there was just a small change made in the Senate to the purpose of the council. So the change is that the council's purpose is to advise, in addition to what was in the House's bill, on best practices, communication protocols, and training with respect to cybersecurity infrastructure. Then the next big change is in subsection B of this section with respect to the membership of the council. So the bill that came out of your committee had a House and a Senate member on this committee, and the Senate removed the legislative members of the committee. They also made a few changes to the other membership, the other members of the committee. So first, your version of the bill had a representative on the council that was from a state electrical public utility appointed by the governor. And this was changed to a representative from a state electrical public utility, to a distribution or transmission utility appointed by the Commissioner of Public Safety. The appointing authority for the representative.
Did they mean Commissioner of Public Safety or did they mean public service?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm
sorry. It is public service, and it's a mistake on my side-by-side.
Oh, okay. But I didn't mean the stats because I'm side by side.
Yes, I will correct that.
That happens all the time. It's both DPS and everything.
Yeah,
Thanks, Becky.
Thanks for noticing that. So the next change is to the appointing authority for the representative of a state municipal water system. So that was changed from your version to be the Secretary of Natural Resources. With respect to the representative from a Vermont hospital, the Senate removed or an accountable care organization, and they also changed the appointing authority to the Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems. And for the person representing a Vermont business related to an essential supply chain, the appointing authority was changed to the chair of the Vermont Business Roundtable. And in the next subsection in this section, subsection C, the powers and duties of the council. So one of the big changes, which we'll get to, is that your version of the bill had the Cybersecurity Council creating standards for critical infrastructure domains. The Senate has taken out that section, which means that in this powers and duties of the council, they have struck out the power and duty to review and approve those standards because they will no longer be tasked with creating them. There is a change to, a small change to the language asking them to evaluate statewide cybersecurity readiness and develop and share best practices for policies and procedures. And then the Senate also added here, so this is on page 3 of their amendment, a new subdivision for the council to conduct an inventory and review of cybersecurity standards and protocols for critical sector infrastructures and make recommendations on whether improved or additional standards and protocols are necessary. And so this new responsibility is sort of taking the place of the section in your bill that had them coming up with the cybersecurity standards. And then 2 more changes were made to their responsibility to identify and advise on certain opportunities. So first, with respect to the state investigating ways they can implement a unified cybersecurity communications and response, they added in some clarifying language to say this would include recommendations for establishing statewide communication protocols in the event of a cybersecurity incident. And then they also added in a new subdivision on investigating access to cyber insurance, including how to increase availability and affordability of that insurance for critical industries. Any questions? The next change is in the meetings section and subsection F. So if you're following along in the amendment, that's on page 5. So there was a strikeout of subdivision F1, which in your bill appointed the CIO as the chair of the council. And this was struck out just because it was duplicative in the membership section of this section, is that individual is named as the chair. So it was just repetitive language. And then a new subdivision F3 was added in their bill. And this is speaking to the authority of this council to enter into executive session and what matters they were allowed to consider that would, allow them to go into executive session. So it says that in addition to 1 VSA 313, which is the statutory provision that allows for public bodies to enter into executive session if they're considering certain matters, this council is also authorized to enter into an executive session to consider additional types of testimony. So first is testimony from a person regarding details of a cybersecurity incident or response to that incident, the disclosure of which would jeopardize public safety, or any evaluations, recommendations, or discussions of cybersecurity standards, protocols, and incident responses, the disclosure of which would jeopardize public safety. And then there's a new language in there that also says that members of the council and persons invited to testify before the council shall not disclose to the public information, records, discussions, and opinions stated in connection to the council's work if the disclosure would jeopardize public safety. I think this new subdivision is just getting at the fact that the reasons under statute that you can enter into executive session might not cover all of the reasons why this particular council would need to keep information confidential with, in doing their work. Subsection G, so this is on page 6 of the proposal of amendment, is the reporting requirement. So the Senate changed what would come back in the report. So in the House version of the bill, the report that would come to the legislature would be on information acquired pursuant to activities required under the powers and duties of the council. And the language in the Senate bill is that the report back would be a status update on the work of the council. I think this was also trying to get at making sure that they didn't want to disclose all information acquired during the work of the council because some of that might be confidential. Subsection H in your version of the bill was the compensation and reimbursement provision that was bumped to subsection I in the Senate version because a new subsection H was added, and this has to do with a Public Records Act exemption. So this is saying that any record or information produced or acquired by the council regarding cybersecurity standards, protocols, and incident responses, if that disclosure would jeopardize public safety, will be confidential and exempt from public inspection or copying under the Vermont Public Records Act. And there is language that says that this exemption shall continue and is not subject to the repeal review. And the new subsection I is just the compensation and reimbursement for the members of the council. The change here is that since there are no longer legislative members on the council, there's that language about legislative compensation and reimbursement was removed. And then finally, still in section 1 in 20 VSA in the new 20 VSA 4663, this was the section in your version of the bill that required the council to review and approve cybersecurity standards for critical infrastructure. And as I mentioned, the Senate struck out that section entirely from the bill.
Okay. Representative Chase, that's the first one that sort of strikes me as maybe really changing the.
Yeah, that's kind of half the point of the bill, but I want to talk with the Scott Hardy and get his interpretation of that. In chatting with the Senate side, it sounds like they were getting an awful lot of pushback from businesses that didn't want additional layers of that they'd have to abide by. And it sounds like the way that he structured the inventory and
It's an inventory and review.
yeah, would is intended to create a plan that everybody could move forward with together. But at this point, it at least establishes the council, which is a start. I have some feelings about it, but
Just from a scheduling standpoint, since this is up for action tomorrow, do you want to wait to take a position on it? Or, I mean, I kind of want to pull the committee once we get through this. I mean, the Senate made a lot of changes. They heard different testimony than we did, and they had some different feelings, I think.
yeah. This is on the, it'll be on the floor tomorrow, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, we could spend a little time on this tomorrow before we get out on the floor, or push it till later in the day. And
yeah, if we can do that, that'll give me a little time to catch up with Sean and Scott.
Okay. Representative Rowe.
Do you know if there was any rationale for pulling legislators out of this?
I don't want to sort of speak for the Senate committee, so they can, they can speak to that in more detail. But I think the stated reason in committee that I heard was that they wanted people with expertise on this committee, and because there was such sensitive information being discussed, they wanted to kind of limit the membership to those who have expertise in this particular area.
Representative Chase.
This is one of those instances where I had talks with my Senate counterpart, and this thing came up, and their position over in Senate Gov.Ops was that this isn't the kind of council that legislators should be on. And my advocacy on behalf of our committee's position was that we know how fast cybersecurity and technology issues are advancing, and the ability to have a legislator at the table who could then come back with all the knowledge of those conversations to share in this room, in these rooms here over in the General Assembly as we need to, adapt. I would say this is one of those policy areas where we really should be, every year looking at multiple things around security and AI and the changing nature of privacy and data. And there's just all the infrastructure concerns. And they were just very adamant that they felt like we shouldn't stick citizen legislators on this council of experts and I think Becky captured what I had heard from the folks from Senate Gov.Ops pretty well. Representative Chase, go ahead.
Given my experience, I would feel comfortable being on this sort of a committee, but I'm not sure an awful lot of people would particularly care to, and as legislators, we don't have security clearances or anything like that. So some of the topics discussed, there's the smaller the group that holds that information, the more secure it is. I would rather have us on there, but I don't think I would not advise the group go to battle over that particular amendment.
I appreciate your flexibility and diplomacy on that.
I would suggest we just, for the heck of it, put one House member.
So I think this late in the session, my concern about, I might be inclined if we had another few days actually to play that game with the Senate, but I also think, in all seriousness, we shouldn't necessarily be composing this because we know we have somebody who has a lot to offer in this vein, designing a council for the next few years based on a particular legislator probably isn't the best practice for us, even though I agree absolutely with the spirit of that. And that one's tough to hear. Becky, there were a few, you were almost done, and then we I got us derailed. I apologize. We should at least get through the walkthrough here before we put this aside for the day.
So section 2. This section in both bills is amending a definition that's already in statute for critical infrastructure. And most of this was what was in your version of the bill. What they added to this is thermal fuels and systems. And the new section 3 in the bill is a report. As I mentioned when I started, there is that new definition of essential supply chain. And one of the things they would like the council to include in its first annual report that is required under this bill is a recommendation on whether to amend that definition of essential supply chain to include any additional supply chains. And that would, and then the legislature could take action to amend statute to do that. Section 4 is the repeal section. So this was just section 3 in your bill. And they extended the sunset of the council to June 30th, 2028. So they added 2 years. And then finally, the effective date is still July 1st, 2023.
Any other questions? No? Well, thank you. I heard the chair say before we were going to hit the pause button on this conversation for a little bit, so I guess we'll free you up to head off to where we need to be next. and good luck.
Thank you.